So with a ton new Sony cameras that are coming out, there's a lot of really good models that are already out and have been out for a while, and they're under $1,000. So if you've been looking to pick up a camera for video, but you don't quite want to spend as much as some of these newer cameras are costing that are just coming out, albeit with great features, but price tag is a bit too much, let's consider some of the cheaper options, but will still give you a lot of bang for your buck. Now there's actually over like a dozen cameras that you can get, even more under $1,000, but there's a few models that I'm going to give some honorable mentions to, but reasons why we still won't talk about them in this video. And that is going to be number one, right off the rip, the A7C and the A6700 that more recently came out, the A6700 being the latest APS-C camera, and then the A7C being an existing full frame camera, but those are above the price range of what we're trying to get to, but we'll talk about those a little bit later. Then we have the Sony A7 III, which by all means is a fantastic camera. You even have some of the other full frame options like the Sony A7R II and the Sony A7S Mark II. But nearly all of these cameras are plagued with some of the similar options. The older the camera, the older the color science is, and it doesn't look that great. Granted, you do have log profiles like S-Log2 on some of these older cameras, depending on the models, but you also have the recording limit like the 29 minutes and 59 seconds that all of those existing models deal with, and none of them have a forward-facing screen except the A5100, but that one doesn't have a microphone port. So if you're using it for live streaming, a lot of people have raved about that camera, and it got a lot of people through 2020 and 2021. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to exclude all of those models just because they don't fit the bill. So that's going to put us in the APS-C sweet spot, which is honestly a really good spot to start with. And you get a ton of lenses available with those, but we're not talking about those now. And then the ZV-1 cameras, which we'll talk about, put you in a 1-inch sensor size that is smaller than APS-C, but you still can get a great look. So our camera lineup is looking at the A6100, the 6400, the 6600, the ZV-E10, the ZV-1 Mark I, and the Mark II. So let's go to the ZV-1s first versus the interchangeable lens cameras, because that's the biggest difference between these two groups. On the ZV-1 cameras, you're not able to exchange the lenses out. So what you buy is what you have. You cannot do anything else with it. And then on the interchangeable lens cameras, those APS-C sensor size cameras like the A6400, ZV-E10, and so forth, you can swap the lenses out. That can get you different looks, whether you want vlogging, and those lenses have stabilization in it, some of them, or you can get a look like this and get a much blurrier background because you can keep swapping out the lenses. So if we stick with the ZV-1 and just look at the Mark I versus the Mark II, it's not as clear cut as you would hope, and the price range definitely does vary from the Mark I to the Mark II. For the price of the ZV-1 Mark I, the original, we're looking anywhere from $400 to about $650 brand new that you can tend to find this camera for. And for the Mark II, it kind of picks up from that $650 on the used market all the way up to about $800 brand new. For the similarities, we're looking at 4K 30p, looking at 1080p up to 120 frames per second, HLG, S-Log2, S-Log3, and some picture profiles available. And you do see a bit more of that expanded creative style on the ZV-1 cameras than you may have seen on some of the APS-C counterparts, which we'll talk about in a bit. And what a lot of people liked about these is that you get an f1.8 aperture to start with, which if you have a bit more background behind you, then you can hit that bokeh button and blur the background out. And these came with built-in ND filters in the camera, which we're not seeing even at more expensive models for one reason or another. And then of course you get a 3.5mm microphone port, which is amazing to have on a smaller compact camera, which a lot of people wanted in the RX100 line of cameras that finally came to the ZV line. But that's about where the similarities stop. On the Mark II, we do get some improvements over the Mark I, but not in the way that a lot of people would have hoped for. You're now getting a touchscreen, which is very well welcomed compared to every other model that doesn't have it. We get the Cine Vlog setting that's new, that came in on the ZV-E1 model. That's a full frame camera and costs over $2,000. On this one, that's under $1,000, which is really nice. And we get a wider focal length. So when you look at the Mark I versus the Mark II Mark 1 had a closer, more punched in look. It was a 24 to 70 millimeter equivalent lens, but the aperture was at an f1.8 up to an f2.8. On the Mark II, we're looking at an 18 to 50 millimeter, but it's at an f1.8 and it goes up to an f4. And if you don't know what any of this stuff means, it essentially means that the blurry background behind you that you would get at f1.8 up to 2.8 is further and further going away, so everything is in focus behind you instead of being a bit more blurry. Now, most people won't notice if you don't have a ton of depth or space behind you. So if you're sitting like right up against a wall or maybe a step or two away from stuff behind you, then you won't notice. But for those that did want to get a blurry background indoors in small spaces, the Mark II just wasn't the better option for that, even though you're getting a wider focal length. And the Mark II also shortchanges users a bit when it comes to that 18 millimeters that you're getting, because they also took away some stabilization stuff on the Mark II versus the Mark I. So on the ZV-1 Mark I, you would get the off, standard, and then active stabilization. That's the digital stabilization options in the camera, plus access to catalyst browse, which is amazing. And you had OSS, or that optical steady shot, which is lens stabilization in that camera. And then on the Mark II, all that stuff kind of changed. Unfortunately, it was just either off, active, and then of course you still get access to catalyst browse, but no in the middle with the standard stabilization. And they also took away the lens stabilization for some reason.
Oh my God, failure.
And when it comes to digital stabilizations between the APS-C cameras and these, and the ZV-1 cameras are a better option than the APS-C counterparts when it comes to vlogging and on-the-go content creation. Now, I own the original Sony ZV-1 and I absolutely love this camera. And even though you didn't get as wide of a lens on the tail end, you could buy a wide angle adapter and that worked out perfectly. And honestly, I would recommend over the Mark II, even though it's the newer, supposed to be better option. They took, I think, one too many things away for what essentially, in my opinion, was just a firmware update and just a new camera body. We should have saw that stuff on the ZV-1 Mark I. So if it comes down between the two options, even though there are some bigger differences between them, you actually are getting less on the Mark II than you are on the Mark I. And I don't think those trade-offs are actually worth it at the higher price point. Plus the fact that that stabilization changed on the Mark II. So going from off to active punches in quite a bit, and you don't have anything in the in-between. Whereas at least on the ZV-1, standard stabilization was great, plus lens stabilization. And then if you needed any more, you could go to active, which honestly is not the best when you're just on the go. The corners start doing warbly stuff and it just looks weird. So for the price, if you're looking for everything compact, built in, fits in a pocket, easy on the go, the ZV-1 Mark I, I think, is the better option between the two. So let's move over to the APS-C options that we have under $1,000. And that's going to take us to the 6100 all the way up to the 6600 and the Sony ZV-E10, which began the ZV Creator line of cameras. Now the A6000 series of cameras, including the ZV-E10, they all share the same exact sensor that's pulling a 6K image down into the 4K. So imagine taking a 6K, all that quality, and just squeezing it down into 4K. That's what you're getting, up to 30 frames per second, 1080p, 120 frames per second. All of these cameras have a microphone port, and then that's about where the similarities end. From there, we're looking at differences when it comes to some of the batteries, some of the battery life, obviously, and some other stuff. So let's go ahead and break these down. Let's start with the A6000 and let's just stay there for a second. The 6164 and the 6600 are updates to the A6000, 6300, and 6500. Yes, I know the numbers are out of order and it really doesn't make as much sense, but just go with me. So the 6100 has all the stuff that we talked about, but no picture profiles. A 6400 has picture profiles, but still neither of those have stabilization in the camera. So no IBIS and no digital stabilization, but microphone ports still. And then when you jump to the A6600, we now get access to that FZ100 battery, way better battery life. We also get IBIS, actual in-body image stabilization on the sensor. We don't get any digital stabilization, but we do get the addition of a headphone port. Now, I've used and owned all of these different cameras minus the A6100, but I have tried it for an extensive period of time. But if I had to choose across from all of these, the A6100 would be an automatic no. Now, when you compare these for the price from what you can find them used up to new, it it really starts to separate things out, because simply going from no picture profiles and less creative style options on the A6100, simply going to the A6400 makes a whole lot more sense, because it's literally the same camera, just more in the camera. And they did go ahead and discontinue the Sony A6100, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad camera. And honestly, if you have no intentions of color grading whatsoever, you don't mind the standard picture profile or something else, you don't get neutral. Let me put that out there, because some people do like neutral, but that's not in the A6100. But it has a microphone port, flip up screen, clean HDMI out, and no recording limit. And you also get the face detection autofocus, which literally all of that is in the A6400. You just get the picture profile, and you get all of the stuff back in the picture profiles for the creative standard and all that stuff. And honestly, for as cheap as the A6100 is on the used market, you can sometimes find it. The A6400 is the same price. It's just a better buy. So I think off this list, we're going to X out the A6100. So now let's look at the A6400, 6600, and the ZV-E10. And when we look at the older cameras, just the A6000 real quick, you have all the stuff that we talked about in the A6400. On top of that, better battery, eye autofocus in video. Keep that in mind on the A6600, and a headphone port. But that's when the ZV-E10 squeezes in and tells the A6400 to hold my beer, because it takes all of the goodness plus the headphone port minus the IBIS from the A6600, and that is a perfect mesh between the two. Now, there is a little bit of debate between the team flip up and the team side flip, or fully articulated screen, or whatever you want to call it. Let me know which camp you're in. But when Sony announced that the ZV-E10 was coming out, it had everything that my A6400 had, plus all the stuff that my A6600 had, plus some stuff that neither one of them have, like the product showcase mode that we saw in the ZV-1. We also get access to Sony Catalyst browse, also like the ZV-1, which neither of the A6000 series cameras have. And we also get access to digital stabilization options, which also neither of those other A6000 series cameras had. So in my opinion, even though I paid like $1,300 something originally for the A6600, and I got the A6400 like back in 2019 around when it first came out, these are great cameras, but when you compare it to what you get in the ZV-E10, it kind of is a great blend between the two of them, but it X's both of those out. Now, I know some people love the A6600 because it does have the better battery life and more buttons physically on the camera, but honestly, you're not missing out on any of that stuff with the customization options that you have on the camera, plus memory recall, so you can customize all your settings, lock in the way you have it set up for photo or for video, and it's literally the exact same sensor. And the price is right in the sweet spot of what you can find either of those cameras at as well, from about $580. I've seen them as low as in the $480s as well, up to about $600 and $700 brand new. So yes, if you look at all of these cameras under $1,000, especially across this APS-C lineup that I'm talking about, it still boils down to the ZV-E10 being the best bang for the buck under $1,000, even though you don't get the Z battery, even though you don't get the IBIS in the camera, but you do get a headphone port, you do get a microphone port, you do get digital stabilization, you get all of the picture profiles, you get access to the vast Sony lens lineup, from lenses with stabilization and those that don't, so you can add the OSS plus the digital stabilization plus Catalyst browse if you need to go there. Plus you get eye autofocus in video, and I personally think the side flipping screen is way better for video creators than the top flipper, whatever you call it, the top flipping screen. And I owned all of these cameras extensively enough to test, try, and use them in real life use case scenarios. And if you're recording indoors, you still get USB-C, which was also updated. I forgot to mention that. The other ones use the micro USB port, and that is okay, but when everything else that you probably have is USB also, you can charge your cameras internally. You don't want to carry one other cable that's the one to charge your camera. It just doesn't make sense. Plus, you also got USB live streaming through the camera natively. So yes, all of them have where you can live stream with clean HDMI out, but you also got USB live streaming natively in the ZV-E10. And that's something that none of those other cameras have. So whether you're buying it used or whether you're buying it brand new, the ZV-E10, I honestly think will continue to be a great camera in 2024 and even in 2025. I did mention a little bit before about the A6700 camera, which is the newest APS-C camera that came out at the time I'm doing this video. And you have cameras like the A7C, that's the original full frame camera. Like if you remember the A7 III camera that came out, is basically that one in a ZV-ish body style, but you also don't get a lot of the newer stuff that's in the ZV-E10. I tested the two of these together, and again, I still just preferred the ZV-E10 over the A7C. That's just my personal preference. But now we have even newer cameras that have come out that if you can save a little bit more money, you can get some of these newer features that are way better. All of them will have eye autofocus in video. You'll also get other stuff that's literally not in any of these other cameras. But if you don't want to go over the $1,000 mark, I get it. But if you do just want to say like $2-3 extra $100, I highly encourage you to take a look at the A7C models and potentially the A6700. But in the next video, I'm going to be talking and comparing those two cameras and why it would make a difference, and a huge difference, to go ahead and switch to maybe one of those, potentially instead of one of these like the ZV-E10. So check out the video on the screen. I think you are going to love it.